assuming.
Who was? I mean, I assume his name was Dewey, but do you know who the Dewey Decimal System was named after?
Dennis Dewey.
Mr.
Dennis Dewey is my favorite Dewey. That is for sure. But I don't know. How do you talk about the Dewey Decimal System other than saying
It's impressive.
thank you, librarians?
Yeah. We grew up in an area where people actually read books still. I mean, now it's more so
You do
online,
just on your device or
but
your tablet. Yeah.
I remember going to the library as a kid, and it was being changed over to the computer system, but you would pull the little card things you'd pull out. And
yeah.
Mr. Dewey was
who
brilliant.
checked it out last. Yeah.
And yeah.
See if you knew anybody.
See if you had checked it out already. Maybe you did or not. So.
Well, yeah, exciting stuff. I mean, it must be a big day if that is what today is. I mean, the Dewey Decimal System Day. Put it on your calendars, December 10th. Find a way to celebrate it with your family.
Start making plans for next year.
So this week we read in Second Kings and Second Chronicles, also in Isaiah, and we'll talk about it all kind of the same story, a lot of it, and then we also in the New Testament we're in 1 Corinthians, of course, with a few psalms as well. And before we get started, let's hear this psalm reflection from Ellen Lauer.
Hey guys, I'm coming to you from an airport near New York City. We are on our way to Liberia, which is why I look the way that I do and have my notes on the back of a boarding pass. So apologies about that. I want to talk to you about Psalm 68. Psalm 68 is it's a hymn about the procession of the ark. It begins with a battle cry and then becomes a song of joy, and it points to God's victories. It celebrates those victories, and it points to his goodness and how just he is, and his protection of those who follow him and the ruin of those who don't. But specifically verses 4 through 6 really speak to me and have been a comfort to me in the past. So Psalms 4 through 6 says, "Sing to God, sing in praise of his name. Extol him who rides on the clouds, rejoice before him, his name is the Lord. A father to the fatherless, a defender of widows is God in his holy dwelling. God sets the lonely in families, and he leads out the prisoners with singing, but the rebellious live in a sun-scorched land." So, as an adoptive mom, there comes a point in your adoptive journey that you're matched with a child, and you know who that child is, but you're not with them, and they're not under your roof, and you cannot be there for them. They don't have a dad who's right there protecting them. They don't have a dad who's supporting them. And that's really hard. It's hard to know that, and you feel that ache and that emptiness when you're not there with your child. And verses 4 through 6 really is a comfort, because it points to just how important children are to God, and specifically the orphan. And they're important enough that he designates himself as their father in the absence of an earthly father. And not only is that comforting to us, but it's also a call to action. It tells us, it calls us to be that earthly father, that we should take his example. If he is going to be their father, then on earth we need to bring them in, and we need to be their protector, and we need to be their families too, and we need to follow God's example in that, and answer that call to him.
All right, our Old Testament time, we are talking about one story throughout 3 different books. They kind of give some different perspectives on it. Most of the reign of Hezekiah is covered here, and so we're going to be talking about King Hezekiah and the exile. So Ben, kind of give us an overview of kind of what we're looking at today.
Yeah, so in 2 Chronicles 29, it tells us that Hezekiah was 25 years old when he became king, and he was king for 29 years. So young guy, but had a pretty long reign as king, and we see that really for the most part, a lot of positive things during his reign that happen. We'll cover the story a little bit more thoroughly as we talk, but overall, yeah, really positive, does a lot of really good things to bring the people of Israel back to God. They've gone astray in a lot of different ways, and he really pursues God and wants to honor God, and it leads to him doing a lot of things that are really great. But then the story ends kind of strangely, in a more negative way. I don't think we should totally, forget all the good that Hezekiah does early in his life, but we see at the end it kind of takes a turn. So the first thing he really does, though, is he begins kind of cleansing the temple and getting rid of like the idolatry that's taking place in Israel. So like what is significant about that, and what's kind of important that we see here in Hezekiah's life?
It's a continual thing that God has been telling the kings to do ever since, like throughout all of these kings that we've like read through. You have these kings that they did not go fully and do what God asked them to do. So they'd leave some idols up. They would leave some things that were kind of like relics of these other like peoples that had come in. And you finally have a guy who comes in and says, no, I'm doing what God said. I'm taking these idols down. I'm restoring like the temple to be what it was meant to be. And he kind of, hey, like the priests are going to be what they were intended for. I'm going to really set this up in that way. And so he's doing really, really good stuff. He's basically saying, this is what God's called me to do. I'm going to do it. Like,
yeah, it's like
shocking
going
as
back
well.
to, I think in Leviticus maybe, and Numbers, and earlier in the Old Testament where
Purpose of the priest.
where God really sets up the priest. He sets up what the tabernacle or the temples to be. Like it's like, Hezekiah is like, hey, we need to get back to what God wanted from us, and he does make all these positive changes. He kind of consecrates the Levites and the priests again, and it says they celebrate the Passover, basically that they have not been doing it every year, I guess, or haven't been doing it consistently.
It's kind of like a reset. Like, hey, like we've been screwing up for a long time.
Yeah, in a good way.
yeah.
Yeah, you see him doing a lot of these really great things, and God really blessing him and him being devoted to God in all of this. But then we see kind of some opposition arise from outside of Israel, from Assyria. And how do we say his name?
Sennacherib.
Yes, that's what we're going with.
Or say with confidence that no one knows the difference.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we see this invasion from Sennacherib who comes in, and what kind of takes place, and how does Hezekiah respond?
Yeah, so he comes in not with great intentions.
Yeah.
And there's almost this taunting. And you have this army that like they're ready to take over, and you even have this confrontation a little bit where it's the people that are on like Hezekiah's side are basically saying, "Hey, can you not speak in our native tongue?"
Yeah, so that
the soldiers don't hear. Like we're trying not to get them like worried and scared, and like no, that's why we're doing it. We're trying to intimidate you. We're trying to make you give up, and we're trying to do this. And we've seen a lot with you have kings who do the right thing, and then opposition comes or hard things come, and they buckle and they cave. And this is a picture of a guy who does the opposite. Like he does not turn to someone else. He doesn't turn to anything else. He just says, hey, I'm going to cry out to God.
Yeah.
And we see kind of this just amazing like moment where you have a king that basically says, we can't do this. And it's like, it's what God's been saying. Yes, this is what I've needed you to get and understand. He says that we can't do this. In chapter 32, we see he just basically calls out. And of course in Kings, it kind of lays out his prayer a little bit more. We can see it in Isaiah as well. And God comes through and he delivers them from Sennacherib, and then like Sennacherib basically goes home in shame, and his sons kill him.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty dramatic turn of events. And you, like you said, you have this like taunting going on where Sennacherib is basically standing outside of Jerusalem, and he's saying, "Hey, like." These other nations that we've already defeated, they said that their God could rescue them too. And look what we did to them. It's very, not only are they taunting the people, they're taunting God. They're saying, your God can't save you. Your God can't deliver you. Don't let your king deceive you. Don't believe him. Like your God's not going to save you. If you surrender and come with us, we'll spare you. But like you said, Hezekiah, despite that pressure to give in and to just give up, he turns to God, he cries out before him, and we see that God answers that prayer and delivers his people, and Sennacherib's life ends by the hands of his own son. So
it's that like taunting just kind of reminds me, it's very just similar to like David and Goliath and kind of that whole like exchange of there is that, hey, we are we're going to defeat you, but there's a higher level of basically like we're calling out your God, and God's not a huge fan of those things.
Yeah. And so we see Isaiah, he's in the middle of this. This is during his lifetime. And so even as Hezekiah is going before God, he's also consulting Isaiah as this prophet of Israel and of Jerusalem. And we see that God is speaking through Isaiah and bringing his message to Hezekiah, first to assure him that Sennacherib will not overrun them and overthrow them, but that God is going to deliver his people. But then we also see kind of the twist at the end of our story this week was that after the Israelites are freed from Sennacherib, or he goes away and they have their security back, that Hezekiah gets sick. It seems that he has this disease that's going to kill him. And again, positive thing here, he prays to God and asks God to heal him and deliver him, and God answers in a good way. He speaks through Isaiah, and Isaiah says, hey, you're going to live. This isn't going to kill you. God's going to add 15 years to your life. But then he also, right after that, we see this other nation comes in, and Hezekiah basically showcases all of his wealth and his prosperity and all that God has given him. And in that moment, he's kind of let his pride take over, and we see, the effect that ends up having, right?
Yeah, we see there's a turning point. That pride really comes in. You kind of see it right after God delivers them from Sennacherib in 2 Chronicles 32 verse 23. So this is after they've been delivered. And he says, and many brought gifts to the Lord, to Jerusalem, and precious things to Hezekiah, king of Judah, so that he was exalted, he being Hezekiah, in the sight of all nations from this time onward. And again, I think it's just a lesson for us that even a really good leader who did really, really good things, you have to guard yourself against pride, because you got a big head and it leads to this sickness and this downfall, and it's just not good.
Yeah, and I think that we might say oh, well, we're not a king, or we're not, this big important leader. But I think that this same principle applies to all of us in our everyday lives. It can be easy when things are going well, when God is blessing us and providing for us and taking care of us, for us to start to believe that that we're doing well because of us, that somehow we have deserved that or earned that, and that can create this pride in us, or this feeling that God owes us this. And so we may not be a king, but we can fall into that same trap of letting pride creep in and becoming complacent in our prosperity. And when that happens, it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I think you see it in things there's just the pastors that have kind of become these celebrities and kind of almost start to believe their own press. Now there are the pastors that have gotten a following and they have good hearts and they're humble, but we also see the opposite side where you see these guys up on the pedestals and then they start to read their own press and there's a downfall, because I think the Bible says pride goes before the fall.
Yeah.
It is kind of a thing where it's hey, for whoever you are and whatever is going on in your life, you need to check your heart and make sure you're not becoming prideful about anything that's going on in your life. God is the one who gives and takes away.
Yeah, and because sadly, the way the story with Hezekiah ends, right, is he gets sick, but God heals him. And Isaiah says, you're going to live for 15 more years, but judgment is going to come during your children's lifetime. And rather than Hezekiah doing what he did earlier in his life, where he heard that bad news and he went to God and he prayed and asked God to change that, Hezekiah literally just says, okay, well, that's fine with me because it's not in my lifetime. Right. Just this very selfish, prideful mindset that has crept into his life. And, again, I think you look at the whole of his story and there's a lot of really great things to learn from him and ways we should, pursue God and trust in God even when things seem like they're going against us. But we also see just the dangers of pride that can creep in too.
Yeah, and so we have this exile that happens, it's kind of like this kind of splits the book. Chapter 39 is kind of that last kind of here's everything leading up to that. And then there's a huge change in the tone, and we read a little bit into that second half, but basically it's kind of we go from, hey, here's what's going to happen, Hezekiah, great job, weird ending, and then we jump into...
And then it feels like something changes
right.
when you're reading.
Yeah.
It doesn't ever, say, hey, they've been exiled, but the tone of the book seems to shift, in chapters 40 through 66. And we started reading that this week, and we'll continue that next week, where it seems like something seems to have gone wrong in Israel,
right.
and they're feeling hopeless and trapped.
Yeah.
And it's like these chapters are trying to speak life into them and say, hey, God hasn't forgotten about you. He is still going to redeem you and rescue you. And this is where we'll read a lot about those messianic prophecies of Jesus coming one day. And so we'll be into that more next week. But again, most of our focus this week in the Old Testament is on Hezekiah. So we'll leave it there and we'll jump into the New Testament next.
All right, our time in the New Testament this week is in 1 Corinthians 8 through 12, and there's a lot of practical stuff. We talked last week, just practical things about living life as a follower of Christ. Like, what does that look like? How is that lived out? And so today we get the joy of talking about food and head coverings.
Yes.
So, what kind of stands out? We kind of have this, food offered to idols and stuff. Like, I've never experienced that in my life, never been at like Deerberg's.
That you're aware of.
Right. I don't think you go to Deerberg's and it's like, oh, this food has been offered to idols, so I shouldn't buy that. So like, what do we take from this sort of like section?
Yeah, I think that's the key here, whether we're talking about the food offered to idols or like head coverings here in a little bit, is obviously these things don't directly apply to us in some ways. And we'll even talk about that. But when we read the Bible, even if there's a cultural thing going on, there is still a timeless truth or a principle, a biblical principle that we can pull out and apply to our time and our culture today. And so that's what we want to kind of try to do here, right? When we're talking about food offered to idols, it seems like what was happening here in 1 Corinthians is that they lived in a city where there were lots of other gods, and there were even temples to these other gods. And if you went to this temple, they even had places where you could eat, not like, like almost like a restaurant in a sense. And if you were to eat in this temple in their restaurant, they would have food there that had been offered to idols that was leftover that they would feed people. And it even seems like some of that leftover food would be sold in the marketplace in the city. And so they were in this situation where they were forced with this decision on whether or not they could eat this food that had been offered to idols. And Paul talks about this, and he talks about it from different angles. He never really gives a strong answer on exactly where he lands. He does give hints, because really what he talks about a lot in these chapters is kind of your conscience, that each person needs to be convinced of their own conscience and they need to act accordingly. But he does also give some guidelines for us as we consider questions like this. Again, for us, that's probably not going to be eating food offered to idols, but we'll talk about maybe some examples here in a little bit. But what are kind of the, I guess, the parameters that he gives for us as Christians to consider as we try to make decisions on things that are not clearly spelled out in the Bible?
Yeah, I think the first thing I have to do is to realize, hey, we don't flip through God's word and say, okay, what does he say about X? Like, I just need him to tell me clearly. And there are times where that like happens, but as we get to the New Testament and like what Paul's like saying, there's a mindset that we have to take on it. He kind of is explaining that through these sort of like examples of, it's not so much about the food. It's this is the mindset as a follower of Christ, what you should have. And so there's a couple things. One, we see it mentioned several times about not being a stumbling block. Like basically, do not let the choices you make trip up fellow believers or someone who may be interested in Christ or who may kind of, maybe a future believer. It's basically anybody. Don't be a stumbling block to anybody from the side of a believer. It's, hey, you have someone who's like Jewish and like is following that part, and they've given their life to Christ. Yes, but like this could be a stumbling block for them if you eat something that is not clean for them. And so he's saying, hey, don't be a stumbling block there, but also don't be a stumbling block to someone who's not a follower of Christ, because I mean, again, you have these things where you can take your stand for the morally right thing, and it is good to be morally right. But in the way you take that stance, you can put so much distance between that person and like the gospel, because you took the right stance, but you did not do it in a Christ-like way. And so he says, don't be a stumbling block. And then we lead into some other things of, hey, what is the goal of this? Like, what is the purpose of you taking this stance? Is it to show people, look, how spiritual I am. I am fantastic. I follow rules so well. Or is it, I am glorifying God with my life? And what does that look like through that?
Yeah, and when Paul talks about this, he uses his own life as an example. He says, hey, as an apostle, I have all these rights. And the Bible gives me these rights. The Bible says that as an apostle, like, that if I work in ministry, that like I, have a right to be paid for that ministry, that I have a right to reap what I've sown. And he says, but I've set aside that right. I've laid that right down so that I wouldn't be a stumbling block, so that I wouldn't hinder people from coming to Christ. Right? He's saying, hey, I have these rights, but I'm laying them down so that I don't become that stumbling block, so that I can lead other people to Jesus and that God can be most glorified through my life. And so I think those three kind of lenses help us answer this question about food offered to idols. Right? He's saying, hey, like you said, it's not necessarily about the specific issue. It's, am I creating a stumbling block where I might lead other believers into sin? Am I doing everything I can to help lead people outside the church to follow and trust in Jesus? And am I doing it ultimately to glorify God? And so I guess the final question on this, and this is really chapters 8 through 10, like what would be maybe an example or an application that we could use for our lives today? Because again, food offered to idols,
hasn't happened in at least 6 weeks.
But
it's almost like you think of something like, well, that could be too tense. Like, well, that's kind of the point of like, hey, there's a tension in like things that people do or don't do, kind of along the lines of, hey, my rights. It just brought to mind a story of my younger brother. He was just kind of an argument with my parents when he was a little kid, and he's just like, I have my rights. And it's kind of like, no, you don't. You're my child. And he's like, I have a right to this. What do you have a right to do? I have a right to go to the library. It's just like, and we kind of cling to that personal.
The decimal system.
Like, and we come full circle, right? But it's just like, we can cling to, I have my personal freedom. I'm an individual, but at the same time, I'm a part of the body of Christ. And it's a picture of, let's blend that, or let's kind of have
I think we can be especially susceptible to that as Americans, because we're a very individualistic, personal freedoms and liberty country. And I'm not saying those things aren't good. I think they are good, but we have to make sure that we're not holding those values above biblical values. Right. That we're not saying, well, I want my personal freedom more than, hey, I want to do whatever I can to lead people to Jesus and not create a stumbling block for my fellow believers.
Yeah, I want to like just glorify God through the way I exercise my like personal freedom or don't exercise it. And ultimately the choice in that is to do that. So what does that look like? The one that comes up, we probably just had Halloween. And I know there's some people that say it's a touchy thing. I grew up in a family that like I have never trick-or-treated until I took my kids out, because my parents had a very strong stance on, we're not doing this because we do not believe this is a God-honoring sort of day. Okay. And again, personal freedom in that. Like there is that kind of that, okay, something that maybe in some like circles is like celebrated as the devil's like holiday and whatnot. And of course there are those like elements, but when my kid dresses up as Nacho Libre and nails the costume, by the way, right? Like, and we go to my neighbors and get like candy, there's not evil in that. And so in the personal, the freedom side, it's, hey, this is not a stumbling block for somebody. Now,
and even to take it a little bit further, you could make the argument that not only, is it not creating a stumbling block, but it might even be creating an opportunity with your neighbor.
Yeah.
For you to give candy to build a relationship is going to maybe be more effective at leading that person to Christ than telling them that they worship the devil and not giving them candy. And I know that's an extreme, that's a caricature, but yeah, this is a conscience issue. Mm-hmm. We need to be convinced of what we believe, and we need to consider these things that we've talked about. But I think Halloween is a good example of just, people land in different places, and our job is not to judge each other, but just to be sure of our convictions and to try to honor God through our actions and what we do.
Yeah, and when in doubt, I'm not against that believer who has a different view of that. Yeah. Is I maybe change what I do, not because right or wrong, but because I want to honor that the believer and not be a stumbling block to them. So
yeah, well, we spent a lot of time there, but I think it was needed, and we'll finish.
You want me to wrap it up really nicely in a bow?
Oh.
Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I forgot the other thing I was going to say.
It's almost.
I moved on to Paul saying, all things to all people.
Yeah, he does say that. That is in the section.
So
he says
there's a tension there. Are you all things to all people, or are you going to be and where's that? Where do you hit that and not be in sin?
Yeah. In chapter 10, he says everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial.
Right.
And that's, again, a good filter.
Oh, the other thing was freedom comes with responsibility.
Yeah.
Just because you're free to do something doesn't mean that you lack responsibility.
Yeah. No one is to seek his own good, but the good of the other person. So
a
lot of wisdom there from Paul. Last, we want to move on to chapter 11. Lots of fun. We're going to get to chapter 12 and spiritual gifts next week because it kind of fits with the next section. But we'll end today by talking about head coverings in chapter 11. Again, another issue that you would say, not really sure if or how that applies today. But basically in chapter 11, Paul is talking about the head coverings that women would wear back during these Bible times. And that if a woman did not wear a head covering, it was very shameful and irreverent. And even to the point where he says it seems wrong in what he says. How do we work through this? Again, we have
carefully.
Yes, very carefully. We've talked about men and women in the church and God's design and His roles for them, and that's kind of connected to this conversation, right? Yeah. How do we, again, carefully? How do we work through this chapter, this issue?
I think again, it's that same principle we just talked about. It's not like, hey, I need to flip through here because on a Sunday morning, who's wearing a head covering and who's not. It's not there's a cultural side of it for sure, but it's also what he's doing is he's also like just reinforcing, hey, this is the hierarchy of like God and the church and God and his people. And so we have this kind of, hey, this is what God has said is good. But it's also, do we have to do that now? And so I think there's that, based on your conscience, you want to glorify God in that. Okay, so, but you can look at our church on Sunday morning. I don't think I've seen any head coverings that I'm aware of. In fact, right now you're wearing a head covering, Ben. And so, but there's nothing special about a piece of cloth or something that is covering your head.
And he says here, right, in chapter 11, he talks about how the head covering is the symbol of authority. Mm-hmm. And this is where it really, again, goes back to God's plan and his design that we believe the Bible teaches about the roles of men and women in the church. And that there is this, God views, and he says this, he says, man is not independent of woman, woman is not independent of man, that men and women are equal in God's eyes. They have equal dignity, value, worth. One is not better than the other, but God gives specific roles to men and women in the church, and he gives men this position of authority, not to lord it over people, but like we talked about in Ephesians, right, to sacrificially lay our lives down for our wives and for women in the church, right? Just like Jesus laid his life down. And so he does give, though, this position of authority. And back then, the way that women showed their submission to that authority was by wearing a head covering.
Yeah.
That's not that's not the case in America today. That's
Right.
still the case in some places in the Middle East and other parts of the world. And this may be more directly applicable to them. But for us, the question is more about the issue of roles, God-given roles in the church, and how we can fulfill those roles, how men can honor God in that role of leadership, and how women can honor God by submitting to that leadership. And so it's a tricky issue and a tricky subject, but hopefully this was helpful, at least a little bit.
Yeah, I think that it's just, hey, let's not get caught up on trying to find out. I just need a checklist of what can and cannot happen here. It's a overall view of that lordship in your life and a submission to authority, that using your freedom that you have in the choices that you make to glorify God. And so again, we have godly women in this church who pray and do awesome godly things without a head covering. And and he even says, hey, judge for yourself on this. It's not like, hey, I'm going to tell you this is the worst possible thing you possibly do. Saying, judge for yourself. Have this lens and mindset of what I'm doing. Does it cause someone else to stumble? Does it cause someone to not kind of want to have anything to do with God? And does it glorify God? If I'm doing that, let's not worry about the small, minute things.
Yeah. Chapter 11 ends with the Lord's Supper. We won't go into great detail here, but just, again, Paul, in the Corinthian church, it seems that people have actually died because they're not partaking in the Lord's Supper in a proper way. They're not treating each other with love and respect, but instead there's greediness, there's pride, there's division, and God has brought punishment and judgment on them because of that. And so he very clearly gives them instructions on how they should take the Lord's Supper and how they can do it in a way that glorifies God. And so that finishes through chapter 11. And again, next week we'll start by talking about chapter 12 and spiritual gifts as we get further into 1 Corinthians. But I think that is about as good as we can do. And if you have lots of feedback and questions, Tom would love to hear from you.
Yeah, email me at jeremy.duran@fbca.us.
So.
All right, well, that is a wrap for this week. We have covered the Dewey Decimal System. We've covered Hezekiah. We've covered head coverings and what meats you should eat. So we've kind of talked about it all. But, hey, our reading for next week is going to be in Isaiah 45 through 63. We're going to see a lot more in this post-exile time frame. And then 1 Corinthians 13 through 16. Then we'll get into 2 Corinthians just a bit as well, and then a few Psalms as well. So check out the reading plan if you have not caught up. But looking forward to talking with you next week.